This is a topic I've been involved in for many years. First of all, growing up in a house filled with epilepsy books and journals, and eventually starting to do some research and literature reviews on my own. So it's very nice to be able to bring this topic to you here. So I'm just going to start with a very brief introduction and then jump into the topic of social and cultural aspects of epilepsy, and also with some narratives and examples from the book, The Brainstorm's Village. And then the second half of the talk is really going to be some lessons from cultural psychiatry and more of the work that I'm doing now and teaching and training residents in our program about how to be culturally competent psychiatrists and how some of those things can be applied to the epilepsy world. And I'll end just with a brief mention of neuroethics, culture, and epilepsy. I'm sure that the audience needs no introduction to the work of Andermann, who wrote the award-winning The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, A Hmong Child, Her Doctors, and the Collision of Two Cultures, which is now used to teach cross-cultural communication in medical schools and residency programs across North America and probably around the world as well. But I'm going to start there because of the sad and very recent news that actually Paul Ford told me about a few weeks ago, that the patient at the center of the book, Leah Lee, died very recently at the end of August 2012 in Sacramento, California, and she was 30 years old at the time. When the book ended, she was living at home with her parents, having suffered severe brain damage from a prolonged seizure when she was 4 years old, and remained at home for the next 26 years, receiving care from her family in a severe vegetative state. Her seizures had begun at the age of 3 months, first misdiagnosed in a hospital with no interpreter, and parents who spoke no English, having just come to the US a few years earlier as new immigrants. So to quote from the story with her obituary that you see on the left-hand side, this was in the New York Times on September 14th this year. Leah's seizures continued, and epilepsy was eventually diagnosed and anti-seizure medication prescribed. But to her parents, Quag Dub Peg, the Hmong word for epilepsy, was literally a mixed blessing. On one hand, Leah's soul had been taken from her, and she needed it back. On the other, her condition portended spiritual giftedness, something many traditional cultures ascribe to epilepsy. Perhaps, the Lees believed, Leah was destined to become a shaman herself. The Lees did not always give Leah her medication, and Miss Fadiman wrote, because they did not want to interfere with her condition entirely. To encourage her soul's return, her parents gave her herbs and amulets, and she was sometimes visited by a Hmong shaman who performed a ritual that included chanting, beating a gong, and sacrificing a chicken or a pig. All of this baffled Leah's doctors. I felt that I was trying to penetrate a very dense wall, a cultural wall, and didn't have the tools to do it, said one of her doctors. The seizures worsened, and by the time Leah was 4.5, she had made more than 100 outpatient visits to clinics and hospitals and been admitted 17 times. When she was not quite 3, in frustration at the issues with compliance and not taking medication, her doctor had Leah legally removed from the family home, and she spent a year in foster care, a time of great trauma for the family, before being returned to her parents. Upon her death, Leah's sister, Mai Lee, told the Washington Post that Leah's legacy is to give families with sick children the strength and courage to question their doctors, and we didn't ask those questions. So given the success and impact of this book on medical training, it's interesting to look back at the creative process that inspired this work of nonfiction. In a 2009 interview with the NYU Journalism Institute, Fadiman explained that she had a friend who happened to work as a doctor at the hospital in Merced that was going to become central to the book and knew about this case. She only knew that there was a lot of conflict between Hmong patients and their doctors. She described herself before writing the book saying, "I was a black hole of ignorance, but that's the pejorative way of putting it. The positive way of putting it is that I was porous and open and ready to be a student and ready to go to Merced and find the right case and learn about Hmong culture and to say to everybody I met in both the Hmong and medical worlds, teach me. And that is what I think being a reporter is all about." She goes on to say that empathy is about getting inside somebody else's shoes and seeing the world from somebody else's perspective that you wouldn't meet in the normal course of your life. I like to meet different kinds of people, she says, and I think if we stay in the center of our world and we don't venture into the periphery, we're going to live really, really narrow lives. So I think this is also excellent advice for doctors, not just reporters, at any stage of practice and also in any specialty. So to hear about some of the positive outcomes of the book directly from the author, I have just a quick 2-minute video clip to show you with some of her reflections and observations, 15 years after the first publication.
I was actually just in Merced a couple of days ago, and I saw the new hospital, and their interpreters are terrific. They have amazing training programs. They let shamans in to do healing ceremonies right in the emergency room. Things have changed enormously on the larger scale. Medical students now take classes in cultural competency. There's a legal mandate for medical interpreting everywhere. So things have really improved, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still room for improvement. There's still enormous cross-cultural gulfs in medical care.
Right. And now in the afterword to the book, the new afterword, you make the kind of startling pronouncement that if you had to write this book today, you probably wouldn't do it.
Well, I couldn't do it. I don't know, whether it was good or bad luck, I'm not sure. But let's say it was good luck. I had the luck to do my research during a time when it was at least theoretically possible to read just about everything relevant that had been written about the Hmong up to that time. It took me about 4 years to do it. Now it would take a lifetime. I couldn't write the book because Hmong American culture is so heterogeneous now. You could never pin it down. It's marvelously, gloriously diverse. So you could never start a sentence with the words, "the Hmong are."
Right.
And also, there's so many wonderful Hmong writers who are capable of speaking for themselves. They don't need me to speak for them. And therefore, the ambition that I had back then to try to capture the entirety of this extraordinary culture, which of course I failed to do, but at least I could have the illusion that it might be possible. Now I could never have that illusion, and I could never write the book.
Okay, so I think she's making a couple of points. One, also that culture isn't static and that things change and people develop and acculturate and acclimatize and move on with their lives. And that certainly happened with this community that was very new at the time that she began her research. So this is looking at a way of kind of breaking down social and cultural aspects of epilepsy into a couple of subsections. And I'm going to give a little bird's eye view of each of these, just to be able to be aware that there is actually a huge literature behind each of these points, and we're going to just touch on a little bit. So epidemiological studies aren't, by definition, social kinds of, they can be more quantitative, obviously, but if you read them, there's some very interesting social and cultural points that neurologists and other doctors put into the introduction and the conclusion, and so you get a nice snapshot of what's happening in a lot of different countries through that literature. Community studies, looking at knowledge, attitudes, and practice. Ethnographic studies, kind of more traditional anthropological work. Studies of traditional and alternative healing. International health projects focusing on the treatment gap, and then a growing research on health disparities and economics, and then a kind of bursting of new literature on epilepsy in the arts and humanities, and then things like personal narratives, first-person lived experience. So epidemiological surveys. So these have been done around the world, like I said, on every continent and published widely, and look at knowledge, attitudes, and practice in various settings and heterogeneous cultures. Often they focus on clinic populations and the need for implementation of community-based treatments. And we know from the World Health Organization that the social consequences of epilepsy are often more difficult to overcome than the seizures themselves. So moving on to community studies, these look at attitudes and beliefs about epilepsy more in the general population, among religious leaders, university students, different subgroups in society. And they can be an important baseline for examining the roots of stigma. So we also need to look at stigma within health professions themselves. This is especially true in psychiatry, For example, working in a general hospital and what kind of care people are getting. You know, is somebody with schizophrenia going to get the proper treatment for a heart attack because people see that they have a mental illness on the front page of their chart? So finding ways to cooperate with traditional healers or religious practitioners is important in moving ahead with collaborative care, if possible as well. And there are some very interesting projects going on in that domain. A couple of studies that stood out for me. One was from Sweden on young adults with epilepsy, looking at self-appraisal, whether they saw themselves as healthy or handicapped, and looking at expression of positive versus negative symptoms, negative emotions in daily life. And there is a very large literature on psychological adaptations to epilepsy as a chronic illness with impact on self-perception, mood, and self-esteem. Another interesting study from the UK called Public Knowledge, Private Grief was a survey of the general public that generally was quite positive. People, over 90% of people found that people with epilepsy they believed they were as intelligent as everyone else, that kids could play together, that people with epilepsy could be successful in their careers or lead a normal life. But despite this positive belief, 50% of the people who answered the surveys felt that people with epilepsy were treated differently by society, and another 25% further believed that they had more personality problems or were somehow different. And this included the group that had direct contact, which is normally a group that has less stigma rather than more stigma if they've actually had a chance to meet people directly. Ethnographic studies. This is one very classic paper by Arthur Kleinman, who's a psychiatrist and anthropologist at Harvard in the Department of Social Medicine. And he did some pioneering work in China on many kinds of topics, including depression, somatization, neurasthenia, and also turned his attention to looking at the social course of epilepsy and how this stigma of chronic illness affects not just the individual, but in a culture that puts kind of groups and the social world beyond the individual, talked about how much the stigma of epilepsy affects not just the family, not just the individual, but also their family, and can lead to a kind of stigma of moral blame and poor prospects for extended family members. More recently, there have been some mini ethnographies described in China and Vietnam, where people were talking about how different beliefs in medical models and traditional and folk treatments were being woven together and used in different ways. And so they were using some of this to design anti-stigma interventions. And again, also in China, more recently talking about greater communication and collaboration between Western and traditional health practitioners. And another study from Turkey that was looking at patient narratives and the way that people told stories differently depending on what setting they were in and what kind of help they were looking for, how to deal with uncertainty and manage hope and optimism. And a very interesting study from India called Disclose or Conceal, describing the dilemmas about whether you would disclose epilepsy to a prospective marriage partner prior to marriage. So India, as everyone knows, has a very high rate of arranged marriages, and more than half of women concealed their epilepsy, which in the end led to a higher divorce rate or separation rate than in the general population. In terms of traditional beliefs about epilepsy, this has been described by Gillick and Gillick, who are neuropsychiatrists in Canada at UBC, as well as having background in anthropology and who have worked in Tanzania for many years. They've divided beliefs about epilepsy into four main themes. So epilepsy as a punishment for sin, epilepsy as bewitchment or possession, epilepsy as a contagious disease, and epilepsy as a disease of the brain. And people have also described that you can hold more than one of these beliefs at the same time. So participate in traditional healing as well as going to your doctor, taking medication, doing whatever you can to really get better. This study goes back a while, but it's interesting because it's not kind of in some foreign land, but it's right in New York City, where Trossel looked at in-depth interviews with patients who were all being followed by a neurologist in New York for their seizures, and found that each one of them was doing something different. So if you think that patients are walking out the door with your prescription and doing exactly what you think they're doing, you may be surprised. So he related this to different conceptions of etiology and efficacy, and really stressed that the social world has to be taken into account, and people make all kinds of different decisions. Studies about shamanic treatment and ethnobotanical cures, this is just one example. There are many studies from different places. It's possible that some of these might have potential medical value in terms of actually having some efficacy if in terms of being checked out in a lab. But it's also another way of preserving oral history and documenting a disappearing way of life, because there aren't too many places in the world that are untouched by biomedicine. International health and the treatment gap is a topic that's had a lot of attention. As you know, epilepsy ranks very highly among neuropsychiatric disorders for causing morbidity and a heavy burden for patients, that there's over 50 million people worldwide with epilepsy, and most of them living in developing countries. And lots of reasons. Paul had mentioned my trips up to the Arctic. The last time I was up there, there was a public health warning about cysticercosis, but not from eating pork, from eating aged and uncooked walrus meat. And so some of you may be seeing the impact of that further down the road. Luckily, I'm vegetarian, so I didn't have to worry about that risk. So we know that epilepsy causes, like I said, a lot of days lost to work, a lot of morbidity, and heavy disease burden when we compare it to other physical illnesses, as well as psychiatric illnesses. And we know that stigma leads to an impact on education, vocation, family life, and other choices, as well as the medical burden. So this kind of stigma can lead to delays in seeking treatment, not just in Africa, but also I was just chatting to somebody before the lecture started. Even at home, we know that with a lot of mental illnesses, people may not know to seek treatment, stay at home for years and not know what a symptom is, not realize or recognize that, this could be helped with medical attention. And so these are things that we need to think about at home as well. But they're just much more visible in certain other places. Back when I was in medical school, I had the great opportunity to spend a summer in Ethiopia with Dr. Reda Tekla-Haimanot, and was able to do a small research project in the location where he started a very lovely kind of rural epilepsy clinic called the Budajira Neuro Project. And so this is a tukul, a picture of a traditional house. And we went house to house and were able to interview some families to ask them what they thought about treatment, what they thought epilepsy was. So this mother had told me, come early for medical treatment and diagnosis. That was my mistake. She'd waited many years before getting her son to treatment. And for most Ethiopians, for most illnesses, holy water or religious kind of bathing and ritual is the treatment for most things, including mental illness. And this is another picture from Ethiopia, taken much later, but showing you that traditional healers really cover a lot of ground. So from asthma to epilepsy, throw in a little liver disease and other things, they're covering the whole ICD, or medical dictionary. That's not to say that they don't have a role. I think there's a lot of work that could be done together in countries where there's not a lot of support, and where this is people's comfort place to go for support. I think it's important to work together with them, and that's happening a little bit more now in some mental health projects. So I'm going to touch very briefly on this topic of health disparities. We know that there are both direct costs and indirect costs to having epilepsy. Direct costs are the kind of costs of seeing doctors, taking medications. Indirect costs having to do with unemployment or being on sick leave. And we know that impact of globalization and migration leads to having more newcomers with epilepsy. I heard that mentioned already a couple of times today. So some studies of Pakistani immigrants in the UK, or things like social deprivation, poverty, in the UK, leading to higher rates of seizures in children, and similarities found in some epilepsy care in the US. There are also barriers to care, a big literature on health disparities, and that's turned to look at epilepsy as well. So looking at points of care, who gets state-of-the-art treatment, and different outcomes. And some conclusions that more ethnicities need to be represented in treatment, better exploration of explanatory models of patients and treatment providers. And this very recent study that probably people in the room are more familiar with than me, but I put it up here just because I think it covered a lot of ground over the last 20 years, but came up with the conclusion that there were ethnic-based disparities in who receives epilepsy treatment, and that white patients were more likely to have surgery than racial minorities. And the next one makes more sense, that privately insured patients may have more surgery than Medicaid or Medicare. Okay, so turning to epilepsy in the arts and humanities. So medical humanities, hasn't existed for such a long time, but it's become really a popular buzzword in many medical schools and departments over the last few years. It's an interdisciplinary field of humanities and arts and how they apply to medical education and practice, covering literature, philosophy, ethics, history, and religion, social sciences, and the arts, including theater, film, visual arts. And so it's teaching medical students and future doctors and practitioners how to have better insight into the human conditioning, into dealing with suffering and social responsibility, and also helps to foster development of skills for observation, analysis, empathy, and reflection, all of which are needed for good medical care. And these are just a couple of the schools where there's a kind of big department happening and publications. Epilepsy in popular culture has a growing literature behind it, a lot coming from Sally Baxendale, who has had many publications about mining out references to epilepsy from the movies, from music and different things, epilepsy in film, epilepsy in fiction, how epilepsy is represented in society. Epilepsy in nonfiction, I'm sure everybody has their own examples and kind of favorite references. This is one book that you might not have heard about because I came across it kind of by chance, and I don't think it's been that kind of well publicized, but it's called The Music Room by William Fiennes, who's a very good writer who grew up with a very unusual family living in a 700-year-old castle in England, and had a brother with severe epilepsy, who, although they had a very sheltered life because they lived in this very remote kind of rural place, had very calm and kind of balanced parents who really taught him to respect and understand his brother. So he has this beautiful quote that his otherness was second nature to me, and that kind of really stuck with me, the acceptance and just taking him at face value who he was and what kind of difficulties he had, including a lot of difficult, aggressive and other behaviors that eventually led him to live in a kind of supervised environment. So he describes his illness with a very literary quality, even a sense of beauty. And I'll let you just take a look at this one quotation about how he writes about a seizure, and it turns into literature somehow. It's not like looking at the clinical EEG representations that were on the board, on the screen in the previous sessions. It's become a work of art, really. How the shaking kind of shakes the vases and bowls vibrating on the tabletops and the French windows going out into the garden. It's a different kind of feeling. So coming back to epilepsy in the media, so there have been a couple of studies looking at how we read and hear about epilepsy in the news and in the papers. And one big study that looked at over 200 stories from 2,000 newspapers found a lot of misinformation, which is probably not surprising, including scientific inaccuracy, making seizures sound very dangerous and lethal, and also writing about either miraculous cures or divine interventions and demonic imagery, and a lot of other things that are not really true to life. And so the importance of having trustworthy, comprehensive, accurate websites that are, run by epilepsy or medical organizations becomes even more critical, because there's been an explosion with the internet, and we'll talk about that in a second. There's, a lot of places to get information and misinformation. So if you just Google seizures on YouTube, there's over 27,000 different hits, many videos. Some are there because they're put up there for public education. Other ones could be privacy violations captured on somebody's cell phone, somebody having a seizure on the street or in a school. And one BBC News story called it a Victorian freak show. There's just a lot of stuff there that people don't have control over and can be potentially damaging or bullying or have very negative outcomes. But just to show the flip side of that, one study from India showed that 3 out of 4 patients who had actually increased confidence after seeing their own seizures on videotape, and a lot of them even recommended it to other people as a way of kind of understanding and learning more about their illness and accepting it. So everything has to have a balance. Epilepsy is also represented in the arts. There was a big kind of brouhaha in the news in UK a few years ago when this dancer was going to try to have a seizure on stage and stop her medication and charge people tickets to come and watch. And she said, my intention is to raise awareness by making it visible and not hidden. So for her, it was an anti-stigma intervention. Other people felt it was kind of voyeuristic and manipulative. And in the end, she did the show and she didn't have the seizure, and that was that. Also a lot written about how there can be increased creativity in people with epilepsy. Does epilepsy enhance creative potential? And there's one interesting website that people can go to called Creative Sparks that has a lot of interesting material on it from Australia. So it's just artandepilepsy.com. So patient narratives and lived experience. This is from the book Brainstorm's Village, or Epilepsy in Our World, that I co-edited with Stephen Schachter back around 2000. And we collected first-person narratives from over 20 countries. Either they were written by or with their neurologist or by the people themselves. And we asked them to focus on explanatory model and impact of their illness. So from Tanzania, a quote, "We went to the clinic and I was astonished to see the very small white tablets and could not believe that they would be able to control my epilepsy, but my parents insisted I give this medicine a try. I've been free of seizures for several years now. I'm well accepted and the villagers are no longer afraid of me." From Brazil, somebody talking about how it's difficult to realize the statistic of epilepsy happening to 1% of people and realizing that you have to be this 1 in 100 person, and feeling sad about that. In India, somebody whose life has been helped to some extent by having surgery, and who is somebody who's really bought into the medical model of treatment, although she's living in a society where a lot of people around her believe in cultural beliefs about it being a curse of God or due to a supernatural power, but she's been able to get married and enjoy family life. From Lebanon, a father talking about the economic burden of paying for medication with having 12 mouths to feed and needing to barely keep up with his expenses. And from Japan, somebody who describes the actual literal meaning of epilepsy or seizure in Japanese, so meaning mad or madman or getting mad, and says that the Japanese words for epilepsy in themselves bring on contempt and discrimination, and that's why I feel that the term tenkan is not appropriate ethically or morally for the name of the disease in Japan. So we've heard themes of stigma versus support, issues around compliance with medication and treatment, family burden, and financial costs of illness. There's also a lot out there in blogs, so just people putting their personal stories on the internet, people who are working in different countries, have a seizure, lose their job. That one was from Japan, this one's from China. Does anybody know how to get epilepsy medication in China? I lost a contract because I suffered a seizure. And so this person couldn't get medication prescribed in China, was getting parents from England, expat person getting parents from England to send medication. They missed a shipment and then he lost his job because he had a seizure. So a lot of stories out there. So now we're going to turn for the last part of the talk to some lessons from cultural psychiatry and approaches that can inform epilepsy care. So when we think of culture, we often don't think about it, actually. If we're like a fish in water, we are swimming along happily, and we don't think about it until we are out of our comfortable environment. So to start with a basic definition of culture from NIMH, this one is that culture is meanings, values, and behavioral norms learned and transmitted within social groups that influence cognitions, feelings, and self-concept. And cultural psychiatry is an academic, clinical, and research area of psychiatry that bridges psychiatry, anthropology, and social medicine. So looking at expression and form of different illnesses cross-culturally, social determinants of mental health, immigrant and refugee health, as well as international mental health. And part of the reason that we're talking about this is not just to explore far corners of the earth, but because we're in a global village, and most cities, not just Toronto, are starting to look very different than they did 50 years ago. And a lot of this work that I'm going to describe comes from this curriculum project that we've been doing to improve the cultural competence of the psychiatry residents at University of Toronto, and has been published recently as a national position paper for cultural psychiatry in Canada. So if we think about this idea that every man is in certain respects like all other men, that would be the universal layer, the bottom of the triangle. So we have biological similarities, we have universal human emotions, we go through rites of passage and kind of live our lives in common ways. Like some other men, that's like no other man is the individual, the top of the triangle, which is where we usually are in psychiatry or in clinical medicine. It's a one-on-one doctor-patient relationship sitting in a room. But like some other men is the middle layer of the triangle, and that's the cultural and social part that we're emphasizing here today. And to think about cultural competence, it's not just an individual clinical description, it's something that involves a system and agency as well as professionals who all have to work together effectively and function to help our patients. So when we think about cultural competence, again, the tip of the triangle is the clinical level, the micro level. The middle of the triangle is the program or institution level, so that could be your clinic or your hospital. So you could have a very effective clinic that has great interpreters and all kinds of things. That might not be available throughout the hospital, for example. And then you have the macro level, that's the societal level, that's the level of legislation and equity, laws against discrimination, and what happens if you get fired for having an illness. That's the macro level. And cultural competence can also be divided into generic and specific. So if you have experience with a particular group, or there's a lot of a certain language group or cultural group coming to your clinic, or you have that background yourself, then you may have some specific cultural knowledge. But how can you be prepared to work with anybody who comes into a busy emergency room or a busy clinic? You need to have some generic skills to be able to work broadly and competently with anybody who comes to see you. And those are some of the generic skills that we try to teach our residents in Toronto. So part of this is learning to work well with interpreters, with culture brokers, and with cultural consultants, or seeking consultation that may be from community agencies or from other sources. So culture shapes the way we communicate, the way we organize our families, organize our behaviors, beliefs and rituals. Pretty much everything that we do in psychiatry is viewed through a cultural lens, and how do we decide if somebody's functioning normally or not is the big question. If we think of culture as an iceberg, and I apologize, some of these words are hard to read, but you think about what you see on the top of the surface of the water. So you see costumes, you see food, you see different kinds of celebrations or rituals, but all the interesting stuff is really below the surface of the water. So conceptions of health and illness, how you define the self, how you think about time, what are your values. Those things are all pretty much invisible, and you're not going to get to them unless you specifically ask about them. We also do assessments of ethnicity to find out what group people really belong to, because what you see is not always what you expect. So it's easy to make assumptions or jump to stereotypes or other conclusions if you don't really ask where somebody's coming from. And this includes parents and grandparents, countries of origin, mixed marriages, asking about patients' experiences of acculturation, how much they're connected to a community, how much their relatives may be connected to a community, and also how much people might connect to ethnic community organizations. And race is also a very big topic in healthcare and mental health care, but it's the one place to kind of think about the dangers of stereotyping and also power differentials, and another place to talk about equity, bias, and potential for prejudice. So this is just a quick snapshot way of asking, trying to see where for a new immigrant or somebody who's been in the country even for a long time, where they are on a journey of acculturation. So if somebody is connected to their cultural identity, but is also able to interact with other groups in their new country, then they would be integrated. If they kind of jump into the melting pot and kind of don't speak or don't teach their kids their home country language anymore, that might be more assimilation. If somebody can live in an ethnic enclave in a country where there is a lot of a population that can support, having Chinese doctors, Chinese employees at a bank, where you can live a life kind of in separation, that would be the separation strategy. But we're most concerned about the people that don't fit into any group. They've kind of lost their connection with their old group, and they also haven't really joined the mainstream, and that's the group that's most at risk for poor health and mental health outcomes. So most of the conference today was kind of focused on the center of the circle, molecular, subcellular, neurons, and nervous system level, and now we're shifting way out to the other end of the biopsychosocial model to look at the person, the family, and the culture and society that they live in, but they're all equally important, I think. And I'm sure people are familiar with Arthur Kleinman's 8 questions, how to elicit an explanatory model. They're just so simple and elegant that they, I think, bear repeating, because we sometimes forget to ask. If asking with the patient, what do you think caused your problem? Why do you think it started when it did? How does your sickness work? How severe is it? What do you fear about it? And what kind of treatment do you think you should receive? And I often ask my patients with schizophrenia or other things, what would you do if you were back home in Korea or in China? Where would you be going to get this problem treated? And what are some of the most important results you hope to receive from the treatment? And this is just highlighted again in this LEARN model about listening, explaining, acknowledging, and discussing differences in ideas about treatment. You make your own recommendation, but then you have to negotiate an agreement. So the N is the most important part of that. And this is kind of our structure in the DSM that is the cultural formulation that may change for DSM-5, but this is what we have to work with now, that kind of reminds us to ask about cultural identity, ethnicity, language, acculturation, people's explanatory models, cultural factors in the environment that can be both stressors or supports, and also cultural elements of the clinician-patient relationship, because this is a very important piece for psychiatry, is the relationship building and how you might prefer or not to be matched with somebody with the same ethnic background, or prefer to go somewhere else. And then you kind of roll that all into an overall cultural assessment. And so when this has been done in research studies, it can actually sometimes change the diagnosis, it can change the treatment plan, it can change the whole outcome. And these are just 2 vignettes from the schizophrenia program that I work with. We have a large group of patients from Sri Lanka, as well as from Korea, Vietnam, and China. But this was a young man who'd had epilepsy for many years, who ended up having surgery, and just 6 weeks later got on a plane to fly to Sri Lanka for an arranged marriage that his family had kind of put together for him according to this special day on the horoscope that was supposed to be very auspicious. So it was impossible to change the date, and he got special permission to fly, and didn't tell his family what had what he'd just been through or what was going on with him at all. And unfortunately, he came back by himself, and there have been a lot of immigration problems that continued after that to bring his wife over. Another man, this was more recent, just this summer, who had been seizure-free for a long time, and suddenly this summer, was in the emergency room, every couple of weeks for seizures. And we found out that his mother had stopped his MPhil because she had been buying some very expensive, hundreds of dollars a month, herbal treatment from India that was specially imported. So we went on a home visit, we drove to his house. This is what you do on an ACT team, that's why it's assertive community treatment. We sat down, we talked to the mom, we looked at all the bottles. I had no idea really what was in them, so I wrote them down and was going to look them up. And then we called the herbal doctor and talked to him on the phone and said, can we work something out? Can he still take this in the morning but take this in the evening? And we also have staff who can go with him to his neurology appointments and make sure he gets the proper tests done, because that wouldn't happen on his own, and he really speaks very little English. So all of this is part of trying to work together to resolve the situation. Just like with epilepsy, we have a lot of anti-stigma work in mental health, and I think sometimes we get so siloed we don't always share that information between disciplines. So there may be some anti-stigma directions that would be useful to learn about together. I think one of the most important things that I've heard is about involving consumers and families in the research and dissemination, and that ideas have to come from the ground up rather than from the top down. And also that direct contact with people is really one of the most effective and impactful ways of combating stigma. So meeting somebody who's in the recovery process and can talk about their experience of illness can be very beneficial. And we're having a conference of the Society for the Study of Psychiatry and Culture, which is a group mostly in the States, but also with some Canadians and Europeans. And this year's theme is on stigma and mental health. And we're having, as a keynote speaker, Heather Stewart from Queen's University, who's the first research chair on stigma, who's funded by Bell, the big phone company, probably the first research stigma chair in the world. So it's in Toronto in May, and you're all invited. And so just coming to the end, I just have one slide on neuroethics, culture, and epilepsy. One, because I don't see myself as an expert in that area, and two, because there's really not a lot out there if you actually look for references on the topic. So I'm just going to mention two things. One, when we think about the practice of cultural psychiatry, one thing that I didn't mention is that we also have to think about our own identity, our own cultural identity as providers, and bring that into the room. And I think we may do that more than maybe than in other specialties. We're also very aware of the culture of medicine in psychiatry as cultural psychiatrists. Not all psychiatrists are like that, I would say. And think about the DSM, not as a, coming down from the heavens, but as a culturally created document that, is decided in boardrooms and, has a lot of political clout and other things. And that we can question that and wonder how things get categorized and how things get described. So the ethics of neuroscience has also looked at the worldview of researchers and how it may differ from communities that they're investigating and what is the potential for misunderstandings. And I found this quote very helpful, that most scientists consider knowledge to be objective, evidence-based, and individualistic. It resides within individuals, and scientific research aims to obtain this knowledge from groups of individuals and to construct an objective view of the truth. By contrast, many Indigenous people view knowledge as relational. It's received and constructed from one's relationships with other people, including that which is passed down from ancestors and with the relationship with the natural world. And so really we need to understand a lot of things about individualistic versus collective cultures and who we are inviting to be research subjects and how we collaborate with people. So in conclusion, the study of epilepsy in social sciences, arts, and humanities continues to develop at an ever-increasing rate. Technology, new media, internet, and increased confidence of patient voices and advocates able to link around the world allow for improved support and sharing of resources and better communication between practitioners and those with lived experience. We've also talked about the importance of a narrative approach, and also that people with epilepsy are resilient and creative and can persevere in fighting stigma and marginalization to create meaning in their lives. And so just a big thank you again to the organizers, to the audience for staying here so late, to my colleagues in cultural psychiatry, especially Kenneth Fung and Ted Lowe, who have done a lot of teaching together, and to my family. Thank you.